Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for Social Media Can Make or Break Your Future. I'm Anthony Giuliano, and I appreciate Purdue University Fort Wayne Career Services partnering with me on this session. Well, when we originally planned this session, it was designed to be delivered face-to-face. Obviously, the events of the past couple of weeks have necessitated that we change the format. And one of the things we're going to reference today is how the job market is also changing as a result of the past couple of weeks. The bad news is that the job market, which has been pretty favorable for job seekers in recent years, is very likely to get much more competitive in the near term because of the coronavirus pandemic. And that presents some serious challenges for college students. Now, the good news is, and what we're here to talk about in this session, is that if you focus on being strategic and if you remain optimistic, and if you do some of the things we're going to talk about here today as a job seeker, you can get great results even in a competitive employment environment. We're going to talk about very specific ways today that your job search strategy can improve. Now, one of the challenges that college students have faced ever since social media first arose is that you have used social media probably up until a certain point in your college life specific to your social life. In other words, social media was all about connecting with your family and friends. Well, what happens as you move forward in college, for some college students, this happens freshman year, others sophomore year, and for the majority, as they are upperclassmen in their junior and senior years, your use of social media starts to impact your professional life as well. And one of the biggest changes that you need to consider making regarding how you use social media is how you're going to adapt to this reality. And it is something that has a dramatic effect on your future opportunities. For example, when you look at the likelihood that a recruiter is going to research you by way of your social media profiles, it's pretty much a certainty that that's going to happen. How do we know that? Well, there's a number of statistics that tell us this is the case. A number of different studies show that almost universally, recruiters are now using social media to research candidates. So you can be pretty certain that a candidate is going to be subject to scrutiny by hiring managers and by recruiters. That's pretty much a definite. Now, there's a little bit of good news in this, because in a study by Career Builder, it was determined that nearly half of all hiring managers find, when they do this research, content that made them more likely to hire the candidate. So that's good news. But there's a little bit more bad news, because it's more likely that what recruiters and hiring managers are going to find when they research you based on your social media profiles is something that eliminates you from the candidate pool. 60% of all hiring managers said that was the case. Now, if you think the answer is to run and hide and to avoid being available online at all, well, I don't want you to do that either, because nearly half of all employers here said that they wouldn't follow up with a candidate they can't find online. So you do want to be present, but you have to be careful with what you share. So the question that we're going to answer in this session is, how should you respond? What can you do when you know for sure that the vast majority of hiring managers and recruiters are going to be looking at your social media profiles? How do you leverage the best about social media, and how do you avoid some of the challenges? Well, what we're going to talk about today begins with a few hard truths about hiring. One of my goals in this session is that you have a sense of urgency for doing things differently, and we'll talk about how the hiring environment may spur you on to think differently about the way you approach your social media use. Then we're going to talk about some pitfalls, some things that recruiters and hiring managers tell us give them a negative impression of candidates online. Then we're going to pivot and we're going to start talking about the opportunities. What are some things you can do to position yourself for success? And this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time in this session. I'm going to start by talking about knowing where you're headed, asking yourself some specific questions that can position you very well to use social media effectively. Then we're going to talk about the importance of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the most critical social media platform in your job search. I'll talk about why that is and what you do about it. We'll talk about the opportunity to create content, to take it to the next level by sharing information about what you've learned and to position yourself as an expert in your field. Then we're going to talk about the importance of relationships and real-world activity. What are some things that you can do that will help you create a social media profile that's robust and help you make the types of connections that will benefit you in a number of different ways in the long run? And then I'll say a few final words in terms of a wrap-up. One thing that's not mentioned here that I want to encourage you to do: you're going to have my contact info at the end of this presentation. And I want to encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions about anything that I share in this session or anything that comes up in your job search. One of the things that I'm most passionate about is helping students connect to great career opportunities. So if I can help you do that, I'd love to talk. So let's dive into the first of these topics, a few hard truths about hiring. Well, the first hard truth is that it is competitive, and it's getting even more competitive in the current economical environment. And what that means is you have to be honest about how hiring managers approach a pile of resumes. Now, we'd all like to believe that they methodically go through that resume pile, giving everyone a fair chance, giving everyone every opportunity to get an interview. Well, the fact of the matter is that's just not the case. What we know from research is that for every corporate job that's out there, there are approximately 250 candidates who submit resumes. From that group, only 4 to 6 are interviewed and only one person gets the job. So there is a lot that has to work in your favor in order for you to be the chosen candidate. Now, some of the things that employers are looking for when they're trimming this pool down from 250 candidates to the ones who will ultimately be interviewed include the following. They're looking for information that supports the candidate's qualifications for the job. In other words, can they find evidence online that that person has the skills, knowledge, and talent to do the job that they need that person to do? We'll talk a little later about some things you can do on LinkedIn to make you more likely to pass that test. Another thing they're looking for is whether the candidate has a professional online persona. We'll talk in just a few minutes about what that means, but that's certainly a factor. They also look at what other people are saying about the candidate. Later, we're going to talk about recommendations on LinkedIn and why they're critical. One of the reasons they're important is because it's an endorsement of you by someone who may be a professor, it may be a former employer. That's going to really make an impression on a recruiter. And then finally, and this one is really critical to understand, when employers are looking at your social media profiles, they're looking for reasons to put you in the no pile. Now, that might seem harsh, but it is reality that when you have a pile of 250 resumes, and I know this from personal experience because I've hired people in the past, when you have a pile of 250 resumes, your goal is to get that down to the best candidates as quickly and efficiently as you can. So things that might seem minor, like typos in the resume or not following instructions in a job posting. And yes, things in your social media profile that may reflect negatively on you can quickly put you in the no pile. Again, we could discuss whether or not that's truly fair, but it is reality that that's how the process works. Now, a related hard truth, the second hard truth I want to share with you is that the quote unquote best candidate doesn't always get the job. There are some things that can help you stand out in terms of a great GPA or an experience with an on-campus group. All of those things matter, but you can have the best credentials on paper and still not be chosen for a job. Now, I'm going to reveal why that is a little bit later, but It's about more than GPA. It's about more than how you look on paper. I'll share how you get around that hard truth a little bit later. And then the third hard truth, and this is maybe the one that's hardest of all these to hear, is that when it comes to what's right and wrong in terms of what you should share on social media, well, there is some black and white, but there's also a ton of gray area, because what's wrong for in the eyes of one recruiter may be perfectly fine in the eyes of another recruiter. Now, as I mentioned, there is some black and white, and you've heard about this stuff probably your entire lifetime. So you know there's some things that are only going to help you if you share them on social media, and you probably know there's some things that are only going to hurt you if you share them on social media. For example, if you are a daycare worker, as this person, who online is known as Ms. One of a Kind, if you're a daycare worker and you post content mocking the children that are supposed to be under your supervision, that's probably not going to go so well. And in this case, this person was fired when this content was discovered. So we all know there's stuff you just shouldn't do. But there are some other things that are more subject to particular circumstances. Take the case of this woman. Her name is Ashley Payne. At the time this photo was shot, Ashley Payne was a 24-year-old teacher in Georgia. Now, the photo shows her drinking a glass of wine, drinking a beer, while she's on vacation in Europe, and not anything necessarily wrong with that. However, what complicates this case is the fact that she was an elementary school teacher, and the fact that her school had a policy at the time that said you couldn't share photos of yourself consuming alcohol. Again, you and I could discuss whether or not that's right, but the fact of the matter is she ended up resigning over this seemingly innocent post, and it did hold up in a court of law that this was okay for the employer to do. So it's really important that you consider specific circumstances when deciding what's right and what's wrong. The comparison that I always make is kind of like a decision about whether you should have visible tattoos and piercings, like this person on the screen. Now, is this right or wrong? Well, my answer is it depends. It depends on what type of employment you're seeking. It depends on who your audience is. So this individual, if he wanted to work at a tattoo parlor, making the decision to have tattoos on his face is probably a good idea. It probably makes him even more qualified for that career path. But if he wants to work in a bank, well, probably not going to be a good decision. So you have to know what it is you're striving for. You have to understand these different audiences in order to know what's right and wrong, what's going to serve you well and what might hold you back. Now, there are some things that dictate how a hiring manager or recruiter may feel about your social media content. One of the things we know for sure is that the age of the audience member does make a difference. There are some changing norms in society about things like visible tattoos, about things like legalization of certain drugs that hit different audiences differently. So you want to understand who's likely to be looking at your profiles. It's better overall to take a more conservative approach, but even within that, there's some variance. Another thing that will affect the recruiter's point of view is his or her values. What do they believe? How do they perceive the world? That's going to impact how they perceive the content you share. Certainly one of the things that matters, and one of the things that you can make some educated guesses based on, is the industry in question. Back in the start of my career, I worked in a large healthcare system. I worked for a law firm, and those were pretty conservative work environments. Today, I work for a marketing strategy company, and that's a much more informal work environment. So there's stuff that I can share on social media today. My employer probably wouldn't give it a second look, probably wouldn't worry about it at all. But maybe one of those past employers would raise an eyebrow and not like it very much. So again, knowing what industry you're getting into is important. The hiring manager or recruiter's past experience also matters. What are some of the things they've experienced? How does that affect their worldview? And there are other factors as well. Now, the bad news is that you can't necessarily predict the values and the past experience and even the age of all the individuals who may look at your social media profiles and make employment decisions based on that. But what you can control is the degree to which you are intentional about what you share. The way that I always put this to college students is to say that you should at least own up to everything you share. It should not surprise you if anything you share is a deal breaker for an employer, because you should have thought through whether or not it's appropriate for you to share. And there may be things that you choose to share that may be off-putting to some recruiters or employers. That's certainly your choice, but you definitely want to factor these things in. Now, while there is a lot of gray area, there are some things, and here we're going to move to the second section of our conversation. There are some things that we know will hold you back. Now, some of these are obvious, but there's also some that are a little less obvious. Let's start with the ones that you probably can predict. So an obvious red flag is content that is overly provocative, inappropriate, things that most of us know are probably crossing a line. The thing I want to stress here is it doesn't really matter whether your profile is private or whether it's public, because as we all know, as we've all heard, even information intended to be private can quickly become public. So provocative stuff, inappropriate stuff, that is something you want to withhold from sharing on social media. Again, that's probably obvious. Now, this one is, again, a little bit in the eye of the beholder. It depends on your age. It depends on the law in the place where you live. But it is likely only going to hold you back if you're sharing content about drinking or using drugs, especially either of those things to excess, because it's going to make you look less than professional. Now, this is one of the cases where changing societal norms may impact the decisions you make. I know college students who may think, for example, well, the laws about marijuana use are changing and recreational marijuana use is okay in some states. Well, it's not yet legal in Indiana. So if you share information along those lines, if you share content along those lines, it's not only something that is going to be seen as unfavorable, it's also currently illegal. So again, we could discuss whether or not that's right as far as what the law in our state says, but right now that is the case, so you want to be wary of that. Absolutely, one thing that will always hold you back is discriminatory comments based on someone's race, their gender, their religion, so you want to avoid that. Negative comments about previous employers or fellow employees. Remember, the people who are looking at your profiles, many of them aren't going to know you. They're not going to have any other context than what they see on your social media profiles. So their perception may be, hey, if this person talked negatively about a previous employer, what's going to stop them from talking negatively about our company? Evidence of criminal behavior, as I mentioned in the case of drug use, yeah, that's not good. That's not going to serve you well. And self-absorption is one that can hold you back, and this may be a little more subtle than the others. If you're wondering what self-absorption means, it's not just excessive use of selfies. But according to a recent article called The Effects of Negative Content in Social Networking Profiles on Perceptions of Employment Sustainability, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but the definition of self-absorption is as follows. It relates to being excessively self-involved, absorbed in one's own interests, and importantly, preoccupied with oneself to the exclusion of others. So you want to make sure that you're not portraying that image, because that can hold you back. Now, there are some things that are perhaps a little bit less obvious in terms of red flags that can hold you back in terms of employment. One, for example, is evidence of poor communication skills. I know that many times you're sharing content on your phone. I know that many times it's meant to be informal. It's meant to be for an audience of your family and friends, and they're going to be forgiven if you have grammatical errors, if you use, language that, isn't quite right for a professional environment. But hiring managers and recruiters aren't going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to, again, because they don't know you well, they're going to make assumptions about how you communicate at work based on how you communicate on social media. So occasionally having a typo, that's not going to make you or break you, but if it's prevalent throughout all your social media posts, that may convey an image you don't want to convey. Absolutely, you want to avoid sharing anything confidential from a previous employer. There was a case of a gentleman who proudly took a photo of his paycheck and shared it online. Well, that was violating a confidentiality agreement with his employer, and he was fired as a result. We've seen cases of healthcare workers taking photos of patients, and sometimes well-intentioned, and sharing those online, and that can get you in trouble as well. So you need to know the rules and need to know what's confidential for your employer and avoid sharing that information. This one is really subtle and something you might not think about, but unprofessional screen names. Again, a lot of this has to do with perception, and you want to be perceived as a mature professional. If your Twitter handle is, for example, StonerDude6543, that's probably not going to serve you well. So you want to take a look at those screen names and maybe update them if you're in job search mode. Absolutely, bragging about absences, lying about being absent from work is going to hold you back, because the employer is going to say, are they going to behave in the same way when they're employed by my company? This one may surprise you, posting too often. If you are too frequently posting on social media, the employer is going to say, well, maybe they're doing that at the expense of doing their job or doing their schoolwork. And certainly there might be days where you're more active on social media, certainly some more active than others. But if you're consistently posting on Facebook, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, or you're posting on Instagram 3 times a day, or whatever it is, that may send the wrong message to a prospective employer. Argumentativeness can also hold you back, especially arguing about politics, religion, things that are going to make you seem like you're a disagreeable person. You want to avoid that. And participating in offensive groups, being a member of a Facebook group or liking a page that has maybe connotations that aren't positive, that can hold you back. And it's not just about what you share. You can also be held back by being tagged in content from a friend that's like some of the stuff we talked about above. So you want to make sure you're on the lookout for what is that overall image that is being conveyed, based not just on what you're sharing, but how you're interacting with your friends online and how they're interacting with you. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can hold you back. There's a lot of things that we've talked about that might make you a little bit nervous. Now, my hope is that you convert that into a sense of urgency and you say, all right, if there are all these pitfalls and there's all these things that can go wrong, what can I possibly do? Well, the fact of the matter is there's a lot you can do. And that's where I'm going to turn our attention to now, and to talk about some ways that you can position yourself extremely well on social media to send the right message to employers. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 different strategies, but the first is really foundational. It comes before everything else. And it's a strategy that involves asking yourself 3 critical questions. Now, each of these questions is pretty simple, but your attention to them, your attention to coming up with good answers to these questions, can go a long way towards making everything else we're going to talk about down the line a little bit easier. So the first question is this: what is your goal? What is it that you're trying to do? What is it that's motivating you? The reason you want to know this is, number one, because it's going to help you make some decisions about what you should be sharing on social media. As I mentioned, one of the things that's going to impact your job search is the different industries you might consider. And if you don't know the answer today, that's perfectly fine. But you do want to think about what type of employment you might want to pursue, because that's going to present different opportunities as far as what you should be sharing. So knowing where you're going will help you know how to get there in terms of your social media profiles. But there's another reason why I want you to really think about your goal. That's because all of this stuff demands a little bit of work. It demands a little bit of effort. And if you know what's at stake, if you know where you're headed, it's much more likely you're going to be not just willing, but eager to put in that work because you see the opportunity, you see the possibilities. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is your goal? Second question I want you to think about is, what is it that you want to be known for or known as? In other words, when people think of you, what do you want them to think? Now, you can't necessarily control what other people think about you, but you certainly can influence it based on what you share. So you want to kind of re-engineer this problem and say, all right, if I want the world to think of me as having these qualities, these talents, this knowledge, how can I make that more likely to happen based on what I share? Simply a matter of saying, if this is how I want to be perceived, I have to share information that suggests that that's really the type of person I am. Now, the third question is related to the second one, but it's a little bit different. You want to ask yourself, okay, very genuinely, what problem or problems do I have the capability to solve in the world, and for whom specifically? The reason this is so important is because ultimately what we're doing online on social media is we're networking with other people, right? We're connecting with other people. And if you think of what happens at networking events, one of the first questions we're going to get asked by everyone we interact with is, what do you do? Or tell me about yourself. And the catch is that when people ask you that, what they really want to know is, what problem do you solve and for whom? The reason people want to know that is because in today's chaotic, cluttered communication environment, they have to make quick decisions about whether your talent, skills, and knowledge are relevant to them or someone they care about, or are they not so relevant? No shame if that's the case, but people need to make quick decisions about what deserves their attention. The problem is people don't answer this question based on what people really want to hear. When someone says, hey, tell me about yourself, or what do you do? What most people tend to do is they'll give that audience member their job title and their employer. Or college students, they'll say, well, here's where I go to college and here's what I study. That really doesn't tell people all that much. So you want to take it a step further. You want to be able to answer this question when people say, what do you do? Or tell me about yourself. And if you do that, you'll set yourself far ahead of most of your peers, and quite honestly, far ahead of people who've been in the working world for quite some time. So you want to know the answer to this question and the other two questions that I just referenced in order to position yourself to have an online profile, a personal brand that truly stands out. Now, one of the places you're going to start using your answers to these questions is on LinkedIn. I can't emphasize enough how important LinkedIn is to your job search and your career prospects. And it goes back to something I said earlier. You know, you're at a point where for the first time, your use of social media not only is impacting your social life, it's also impacting your professional life. And what that means is you no longer can or should use social media for just social reasons, for just sharing with your family and friends. The bottom line is, while, yeah, you're probably still going to spend time on platforms like Instagram and Facebook and TikTok for some of you, while it's okay to spend some of your time on those things, it's really incumbent upon you, if you want to reach your goals professionally, to start taking some of that time and converting it to time spent on LinkedIn. And if you're already spending time on LinkedIn, good for you. But my suspicion is most of you should be spending more time on LinkedIn. Why do I say that? Well, it's the platform of choice for employers. Here's just one example. This is a gentleman named Matt Earhart, who is in the recruiting world. And he says, and this is what most recruiters say, I'm most interested in the candidate's LinkedIn profile because that's what's most relevant. Now, another added benefit of spending more time on LinkedIn is it can help you avoid some of the pitfalls that come with other platforms. Here's a quote that speaks to that point. This comes from a study done by the company Paychex. They said in terms of where you are most likely to encounter problems, Facebook is absolutely where hiring managers most often find incriminating information. About 2 in 3 say that's true, whereas only about 4% say that on LinkedIn. One of the things I like about LinkedIn is it's a relatively safe place to be. You're not going to get into a lot of political arguments. You certainly are going to be much less likely to post provocative information. It's going to be relevant to your professional life because that's what LinkedIn is all about. Now, I'm going to talk about using LinkedIn beyond the basics. In the interest of time, I don't want to talk about how you start a LinkedIn profile or, profile photos or some of that more basic stuff, because honestly, that's pretty easy to find. What I'm going to focus on is a few things that you're not going to hear from most other LinkedIn trainers that are next level, but that can truly set you apart on LinkedIn. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do is to make sure that your story on LinkedIn is future facing. What do I mean by that? Well, it's simply a matter of positioning yourself for the next opportunity you want to pursue, not just rehashing everything you've always done to date. Not focusing on the past, but instead focusing on the future. What I find is that most people use LinkedIn in the same way they use a resume. They say, okay, I'm going to list all the jobs I've ever had. I'm going to list all the education I've ever received. I'm going to list all the skills I've ever used. And then I'm going to leave it up to the audience to decide how that's relevant to them. Well, I don't want you to do that. What I want you to do instead is to say, okay, now that I know what my goal is, because I've asked myself those 3 foundational questions, now that I know what I want to be known as among my audience members, known for among my audience members, now that I know what problem I solve and for whom, I'm going to start telling a story that backs that up. I'm going to take the information I have and focus on the future and not focus on the past. And that may mean omitting some stuff from the past, and it may mean adding some substance to the things that you truly want to be known for among prospective employers, prospective coworkers in the future. Now, I'm going to give you a subtle example of what I see most college students doing on LinkedIn and what I'd advise that you do instead. A lot of college students, I would say the majority of college students, when they're populating their LinkedIn headline, and that's the phrase you see right below the person's name here. I've blocked out the name and face to protect the innocent, but you see where it says kinesiology student at Purdue University. That's a LinkedIn headline, and you have complete control over what that says. What I find is that most college students say, okay, here's what I'm studying, and here's the college I go to. Well, while there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, it doesn't say a lot, and it's certainly not future facing. I'll give you a couple examples of what I like better than this. I would suggest that you not do this. Instead, what I'd like you to do is something that looks a little more like this. This is a student who says not only is she a kinesiology student, but here's the kicker, aspiring occupational therapist. If you're an employer and you're looking for occupational therapists, this is going to resonate much better than just saying kinesiology student. Now, something I like even more, if you want to take this to the advanced level, is what this student does. She says in her headline, passionate marketer, successful college athlete, future professional sports businesswoman, and incidentally earned her MBA in 2019. So it's really positioning yourself to be seen as a peer to the people already doing that work, instead of being seen as someone who is who is just learning to do that work. Now, I don't want you to say anything that's untrue, but the fact of the matter is, you need to take credit for what you're learning, and speaking in those future terms can help you quite a bit. Now, another thing I want to encourage you to do is to request recommendations, not just endorsements on LinkedIn, but written recommendations. Recommendations are that third-party endorsement, that opportunity to have other people say great things about you. It could be a former professor, it could be a former employer. Whatever the case, you want to make sure that you're not the only person telling your story on LinkedIn. You have 2 or 3 recommendations that speak well of you. That's going to make you stand out quite a bit from the pack. Absolutely, one of the most important things that I encourage you to do on LinkedIn is to consistently share posts, to consistently share status updates. Most people rely on their LinkedIn profile alone to tell their story, and I highly encourage you to do more than that. Let me explain why. When I'm talking about posts on LinkedIn, I'm talking about the opportunity that comes when you hit the homepage and LinkedIn says share a post in this little white rectangle. When you do that, when you share some copy, and it could be linked to an article, it could be included with a video, any number of things, that's going to be populated in the news feed when your connections log on to LinkedIn. Now, let me explain why this is infinitely better than relying on your profile alone. If I don't do this and I rely on my profile alone, in order for my story to be heard by my audience, I would first have to spontaneously pop into their head. They'd have to think of me out of the clear blue. Then they'd have to seek me out. Then they'd have to digest all the information in my profile. Well, why do that alone when sharing status updates can help you overcome all the challenges that come with relying on your profile alone? You know, when I share a status update, I am overcoming that need for people to think out of me out of the clear blue, because when they log on to LinkedIn, there I am, like a billboard on the highway, very hard to ignore. They then don't need to seek me out, and I'm giving them little stories, little digestible nuggets about my experience, about what I do professionally, that tell a story that over time makes much more of an impact than what you would say in your profile alone. Now, I'd encourage you to do this at least a few times a week, ideally once a day, sharing things like this. I'm not going to talk about each of these, but I do want to give you some idea of some of the things you could be sharing. As college students, you have a tremendous advantage because you're learning so much. You're diving into so many different topics. You want to make sure that what you're discussing on LinkedIn is aligned with what you want to be known for and known as, of course. But you can share something you learned. You can share a project you're working on. You can share content that you've created. You can share industry news about whatever career path you want to pursue. You can ask the audience questions. You can reshare job opportunities from employers with your peers. Any number of things. The key thing is to be present and to do this consistently. I'll say this with 100% confidence. The people who get results from LinkedIn are the individuals who consistently share content. Those who don't get results from LinkedIn are those who don't share content. It is a difference maker. It is absolutely worth your time, and it's one of the best ways to stand out on LinkedIn. Now, I also want you to think about how you're interacting with other people on the platform, because a lot of people just kind of collect connections on LinkedIn. You know, they just sort of accept connection requests, send connection requests, and then they don't really do anything with those connections. Well, there's a much better way to leverage your LinkedIn network, and that is by truly connecting with people. And this is simply a matter of being visible and being generous with your network. One of the first things I'd encourage you to do is to actively look for opportunities to help, to occasionally log on to LinkedIn and just say, you know, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, all I'm going to do is help people. I'm going to answer questions that are aligned with my expertise. I'm going to share content that others have posted to amplify the potential of that being seen. I'm going to see if there's an opportunity for me to help someone and to be of service. If you do that, I can guarantee you're going to build a strong, robust network. Now, one of the little things you can do is simply interact with other people's content. As I mentioned, you can share it, you can like it, you can comment on it. That's going to help the individuals in your network derive more meaning from the content they're sharing, and not incidentally, it's going to make your relationship with that person a little bit better. Now, you don't have to do this 100 times a day, but I'd encourage you to at least a few times a day engage with other people's content. Absolutely, you want to be as generous with recommendations and endorsements as you would hope that others would be with you. You can use LinkedIn to make introductions. If you know people in your network who would benefit from getting to know one another, you can be the facilitator of that introduction. Absolutely, you can simply use LinkedIn to check in with those with whom you've lost touch. One of the things I know from teaching college classes myself is I might have a student who's in a class one semester, and that student performs exceptionally well, and we build a good relationship for a few months, but I may never hear from that student again. I want you to revisit those relationships. Use LinkedIn to keep that person in contact with you and to help them stay aware of what you're working on. And if you do lose real world connection with that person, to reinvigorate it, to reach out and to be more visible to that person. One of the best ways you can do that is being generous with that individual and with your network, but certainly you just want to remain connected in the real world. Now, in addition to what you're doing on LinkedIn, there's another thing you can do that's even more advanced. I mentioned on LinkedIn, one of the most important things is sharing status updates, creating content. But I want to take that a step further and say, if you really want to stand out, if you want to be an exceptionally good job candidate, one of the best opportunities you have today is the opportunity to create content, to share your knowledge with the world, to position yourself as an expert. Now, what holds people back from doing this? Because everyone has the opportunity to do it. It's actually one of the places where I'm a little bit envious of you as college students in the year 2020, because when I was a college student, this opportunity simply didn't exist. But for you, you have ample opportunity, and everyone has the opportunity today to create content. You could right now start a blog about anything you want, and no one would stop you. But the one thing that holds people back is time. When I say to people that content is the big differentiator, it's the thing that confers expertise upon people. It's the thing that helps people build great careers and get noticed. What I hear constantly is, yeah, that's great, but I don't have time to create content. Well, one of the things that I want you to understand is if you're trying to find the time to do this, if you're trying to find the time to create more content, one of the things you're probably going to have to do is to make a trade-off and consume less of the content that maybe isn't helpful to your future goals. I'm seeing this right now with what's happening with the coronavirus pandemic and people being self-quarantined. I'm hearing about people, binge watching shows on Netflix and, doing all this stuff that a little bit of it is okay. But please trust me, I'm okay with some downtime. I think everybody needs it. But I know people who've been self-quarantined for a week and they're just consuming kind of this mindless stuff. Again, a little bit of that is okay, but what if you took some of that time and instead of just being a consumer of content, what if you became a creator of content? What if you started learning public speaking skills and putting together presentations that you could share once it's possible for us to be back together in the real world? What if you became great at that? What if you took your ideas and turned them into a blog? What if you used video to share your knowledge with the world? Maybe you're a photographer. Maybe it's photo storytelling. It could even be being a guest on podcasts. It could even be starting your own podcasts. Here's the thing. If you think these opportunities aren't for you, if you think you're not ready for these opportunities, I want to challenge that and say that no one will stop you from doing it. And the only way to learn how to do it is to actually dive in. Certainly you have to have something to say. Certainly you have to have a perspective, but think of how great it would be for you as a job seeker. If you could go to a company you want to work for, with not just a resume, because everybody's got a resume, with not just references, because everybody has references, but what if you could also say, here is 3 months, 6 months of content I've created that demonstrates my expertise, that shows how interested I am in this industry, in this topic. That I can tell you is going to stand out with employers. That for sure will position you to be one of those people who gets an interview and perhaps even gets the job. But it takes work. You're going to have to decide whether you have the discipline to say, I'm going to spend less time on the easy stuff, consumption of content, and put more time into the things that are going to position me well for the future. Just like making a choice to say, all right, I'm going to not only use social media for my social life, I'm going to use it to move my professional life forward. You need to make a decision about whether you're going to do that with content creation. We all have the same number of hours in a day. We all have 24 hours. What sets successful people apart is the degree to which they spend time working towards their goals, that they carve out as much discretionary time as they can, and they put that time to good use. Now, the last strategy that I want to encourage you to invest in is relationships and real-world activity. The bottom line is that while social media absolutely matters, while social media can be a differentiator for you in your job search, the thing that matters perhaps most of all, the thing that can help you overcome a less than stellar GPA, in fact, is relationships. Now, it does matter that you have knowledge, skills, and talent, but knowledge, skills, and talent are only going to take you so far. This is a quote from Tom Peters. Tom Peters is a management guru who's been around for decades, and he says this. He says the most important personal core competency by far is a rich set of relationships. In other words, you may be up against someone who has a better GPA when you're going for a job. You may be up against someone who has more on-campus involvement. But if you have a better relationship with people at that company, you're going to even the playing field and perhaps even have an advantage. Now, let me give you an example of this in action. This is from my personal experience. There was one day when my company was looking to hire an entry-level staff member. And the hiring manager came to me and said, hey, can you help me get the word out that we're looking for this person? So I did what I typically do in that situation. I went to LinkedIn. I created a post that said, here's what we're looking for. Here are some of the skills you need in order to qualify for this job. I posted that, and it wasn't more than an hour later when I got a response from this person. His name is Nick. Nick, at the time, worked and taught at a local university, Trine University. And he said, hey, saw the post. I happen to know a student who meets that criteria, and added bonus, because I know this person personally, Nick said, I think he'd be a really great fit for your culture. And cultural fit, we all know, is tremendously important when it comes to employers selecting candidates. So with that information, I said, great, love to have an introduction to this person. And the next step was Nick connected me to this job seeker. Coincidentally, his name is Anthony, just as mine is. But he connected the two of us, and the story has a happy ending because Anthony got the job. And I can tell you for sure that if he had just been another resume in the stack, if he had been someone who came in without an introduction, he probably would have had a much, much less of a chance of being chosen for that job. It's not the only thing that matters, but it certainly is a differentiator when you have great relationships. So I want you to build good relationships with your employers. I want you to build good relationships with your professors. I want you to build good relationships with people who are in the industry you want to work in. And I certainly want you to take advantage of other opportunities to build relationships. You know, there's a team at Purdue University Fort Wayne in Career Services that is eager to meet you and help you. And what they have is unmatched relationships with employers throughout the region and beyond. So if you're looking to get connected to employers. If you're saying, well, I'd love to have those types of relationships, but I don't know anyone, start here. Go see the folks in career services. They're eager to help you. Build a relationship with them, and they'll help you build relationships with individuals who can make you successful as you start your career. Now, there's also some other things you can do to build relationships and, as an added bonus, to get some experience that's going to help you stand out to employers. One thing I'd encourage you to do is to seek out internships. You probably know that already, but internships are great because you get job experience and you have a lasting relationship with coworkers that may translate into a job opportunity down the line, but at the very least can translate into, if you use the opportunity well, can translate into a LinkedIn recommendation. It can translate into introductions to other prospective employers. But one of the things that is less appreciated, but sometimes equally as good, is the informational interview. Now, informational interviews are when you have the opportunity to sit across from an employer. Now, that employer may not necessarily have a job opportunity right then and there, but this is when you ask a company to speak to someone about its industry, about its culture, maybe talk to that person about his or her career path. The great thing about informational interviews is not only are you going to get the information that you're seeking as part of that conversation, but you're also going to have an opportunity to build a relationship with the person on the other side of that desk, and that may translate into a real world job opportunity down the line, even though it's not truly a job interview. I'll give you an example of this one as well. There was one day when I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from the young man on the right. His name is Sean McMahon. Sean McMahon happens to be a graduate of Purdue University, Fort Wayne. Sean called me and said, hey, I'd like to learn more about the agency world. I'd like to learn more about the work you do. Are you willing to sit down with me for an hour? And I was. I had the time. I was eager to do it. And I didn't have any job opportunities to offer Sean, but it was a really great conversation. We talked for a little over an hour. He made a great impression on me. And lo and behold, a couple months later, when we were looking for our next intern, Sean was top of mind. He was the first person I thought of. I reached out to him. He ended up doing an internship at the company I worked for, and it was a great experience for us, and I believe it was a great experience for him. And it all started with that informational interview. So even if you can't get an internship at a company you want to work for, seek out those informational interviews. That's another place where career services can help you. So relationships absolutely matter. So does the relevant experience that you can get from an internship. But I also want to encourage you, if you can't get an internship, to seek out volunteer experience that helps you showcase what you're capable of. You know, there's a lot of nonprofits who need help with finance, who need help with marketing, who need all kinds of help and support. And if you volunteer for those organizations, not only are you going to be able to demonstrate that you've done the type of work that employers are looking for, but you're going to build relationships with the staff at those nonprofits. You're going to build relationships with other volunteers, and that's going to serve you extremely well down the line. You know, when people say to me, college students ask me all the time, they're like, hey, how do you get experience when every job asks you for 2 to 3 years of experience? And I say the only shortcuts are relationships, internships, and volunteer efforts. So that absolutely can set you apart. Now, even if you don't have relevant work history, having a work history of any kind that shows your work ethic will help you. Volunteer efforts, even outside of those things, relevant to the path you want to pursue, are still worthwhile. So even if you can't get that relevant experience, still consider working while you're in school if you can pull that off, and still considering volunteering. Those things will serve you well because of the relationship factor. And absolutely another thing that can set you apart is involvement in on-campus groups or involvement in athletics. What you want to present yourself to employers as is a complete person, not just someone who just went to class, but someone who's been involved in other ways that benefit others. That's how ultimately you're going to benefit yourself. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. You know, I've shared information about the challenges that you're probably going to face as you pursue a career path. I've shared information about some of the pitfalls that come with social media, and I've shared some information about how you can stand out as a job candidate by doing things like using LinkedIn effectively, building real world relationships, creating content. And I know that this might sound like a lot, but you don't have to do it all at once. I want you to take it one step at a time. And it might be tempting to wait. It might be tempting to say, well, I'm only a sophomore. I don't need to worry about this stuff until I'm a senior. Or, yeah, I'm a senior, but I want to enjoy my last semester of school. I'm going to wait until the summer to do this stuff. Well, if that's what you're thinking, I want to encourage you to think differently. Because if you know what your goals are, and if that's where you want to go, the sooner you start doing this stuff, the more likely you're going to realize those goals, and the more likely it is that you're going to have a long, successful, fulfilling career. Well, I want to thank you again for being part of this session. Thanks for your time. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions for me, I'd be eager to